Great to still see such a packed room here. Thank you so much for coming to our first, what we believe will be our annual policy summit here in Sacramento. I'm thrilled to be here today with our partner, Michael Quigley, Executive Director at California Alliance for Jobs. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Heidi.
So for a little bit of background on Michael and his organization, Michael has spent the past 20 years helping shape how California invests in the systems that keep the state running, from transportation and water to climate resilience. And for a bit more background on the organization, California Alliance for Jobs is a unique labor management organization, and it sits at the intersection of infrastructure, climate policy, economic growth, and they're pushing for solutions that not only respond to today's challenges, but really help California build a stronger future. Today we're going to be exploring a deeper dive from the past conversation we had on energy, really focused on California's cap and trade program. And one of the things that we're going to be unpacking today is really how that program goes beyond meeting climate targets to overall, I think, building a California that's more connected, more sustainable. So, Michael, let's jump right in. California's cap and trade program is set to expire in 5 years. I can't even believe we're talking about 2030 right now, but we are. Can you give a brief program overview? What is the program? How does it work? Where does it currently stand? Just help us set the scene a bit here to start.
Sure. And thank you for the opportunity, Heidi. It's really great to be here in front of all these, smiling faces. And Sacramento has really been the leading capital in climate policy, right, for the last 20 years. And the cap and trade program was originally authorized in 2006 under AB 32 and created the authority for the market mechanism that you heard from the previous panel, the stakeholders, discussing the, sides of the different discussion on the renewal. But cap and trade has been something that has grown in terms of its revenue, and hearing today that the latest round of auctions actually exceeded expectations, which I think is a good thing for the future of the program. But it has then sold credits on these markets on a quarterly basis, going now for almost 20 years. And hopefully, as part of the legislative discussion this year, will be reauthorized for another 10 or 15 or maybe even longer period. Last reauthorization was done around 2014 under Governor Brown. And that created a structure for the program where about roughly 2/3 of the program was continuously allocated towards different priorities that included rail, housing, other types of programming, and then 1/3 of that program was discretionarily allocated by the legislature. And so as we get into the next iteration of the renewal, that will be an important part of the conversation in terms of what allocation will be continuously programmed towards different priorities and what part will be annually programmed, which I think actually has some significant consequences about the long-term impacts of the project, like how the legislature decides to structure that.
So you and I were talking about this right before that, our last panel, there was a lot of focus on the market mechanisms around this. But a really big question that I want to unpack with you more is, where does all this money actually go? And would love to just hear from your perspective, what is working, what still needs improvement, but maybe even more importantly, where are the opportunities on this?
So one of the things that the governor has been is rebranding the program as Cap and Invest. And I think that's an important evolution of the message, because really that's a big part of what we're talking about. There's the market side, which determines the affordability issues that were discussed and will be discussed on the next panel. And then on the investment side, what will we do with the money? What will we allocate it towards? Currently, high-speed rail gets about 25% of the annual allocation. Housing, affordable housing, sustainable communities is also getting 10%. There's 10% for transit rail capital programs, 5% for transit operations. These are all things that have had sustaining value in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the state, and are things that the coalition that the Alliance for Jobs is working with really supports continuing to invest. We can talk a little bit more about that. So I think the opportunity there lies in doubling down on some of these climate resilient infrastructure investments and making the sort of generational investments that will allow the state to transition to a zero emission and clean economy in the near future.
So when we think about cap and trade, it mostly gets associated with environmental issues like air pollution, emissions. But as you've already started to tease in this conversation, whether it's high-speed rail or beyond, the program just reaches so much farther than that in terms of the impact. So we'd just love to get a fuller picture from your perspective about what is reauthorization, what is that actual trickle-down effect for all of the communities in California?
So one of the things that is up for consideration is the infrastructure and climate resilience pieces. Those have, I think, the biggest direct impact in terms of job creation. You look at the middle class jobs that are created through the construction industry, that's direct employment. But then one of the benefits of making these infrastructure investments is that they have indirect benefit to all of the users of the system, whether that's building a new transit line. There's been about 245 projects that have been funded, transit projects that have been funded so far under the cap and trade program, which is roughly the equivalent of 5 million automobiles less on the road by having these transit expansions. So there's a lot of structural change that comes from making longer term programmatic investments in climate infrastructure. And that, I think, is one of the greatest potential outcomes for the cap and trade program, that we need to really look longer term, structurally program things that will have the greatest amount of GHG reduction through job creation, air quality improvements, and then finally creating tangible public assets that politicians can point to and say, this is what we did with your funds. We created new infrastructure that you get to utilize and benefit from, and also the environmental benefits are realized through these creation of the infrastructure. And I think that's one of the things that, the opportunity that lies within cap and trade.
So when we look to 2030 then, what's your honest take on the best case scenario? And if we really look at a successful reauthorization in earnest, what does that look like for you?
So the Alliance for Jobs is working closely with a coalition of labor management and labor, business, and local government groups. We are advocating for a 5-point principle document. The coalition is called the Climate Safe Infrastructure Coalition. Some of the members may be represented here in the audience today, but the Alliance is working with the League of Cities, the California Transit Association, the California State Association of Counties, California Building Industry Association, other groups, dozens of other groups, who are really trying to create a voice for a comprehensive package of infrastructure investments. And so this is what we're hoping for, that the legislature could make these prioritizations. And the buckets come across really 5 areas of significance for climate infrastructure. First would be prioritization of rail and transit capital programs so that we can execute the state's rail plan by 2050 and build the sort of infrastructure of the future that we need. The next part would be, in the affordable housing and sustainable infill development. There's a lot that needs to be done in order to fund the implementation of SB 375 and give infrastructure tools to local governments so that they can build the density around these transit hubs that will ultimately achieve the climate goals by VMT reduction, as well as have tremendous job creation value. We'd like to see significant investment in wildfires. Obviously that is something that is a perennial issue here in California, and greenhouse gas emissions associated with that, have potential to cancel out any gains we make in other areas. So that needs to be prioritized. We'd also like to see investments in clean transportation and climate adaptation, I think that's one area the state has not structurally funded a climate adaptation, climate resilience program. It has allocated money over the years, but only on a one-time basis. And so we think that cap and trade could be used to strengthen like our seawalls and ports and coastal airports and the sort of things that will allow the state to better weather the ups and downs of a more oscillating climate based off of the future that we are going to be ultimately experiencing, because California, at least for the next 3 years, is on its own with climate policy. So I think it's very important that we lead, we show a path forward that actually charts great value and creates the sort of climate outcomes that others would hope to model, which is what ultimately Mary Nichols said in 2006. Even she was talking about the implementation of the first cap and trade program, and she had made comments to the effect that if this is done properly, it will be a model for other states to eventually adopt. So I think that's part of what could potentially happen by 2030, and we could see something that would really allow the next generation of Californians to benefit from.
I love the optimism around it. I am curious because there are so many different priorities within what you've been talking about, whether it's rail, wildfire prevention, waste management, housing. There's so many different issues. We've got a room full of lawmakers and their staff that are very engaged in this event today. What do you think that they should be putting their energy into with all of those different priorities if they want to make meaningful sort of holistic change on this program?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because part of the structural problem, right, is you have a limited pot of resources. So the more buckets that you invest in, right, the more diluted those investments become. One of the things that the Climate Safe Infrastructure Coalition is advocating for is more structural allocation into limiting it into these 5 areas that we think have our 6 areas of the coalition that have the most impact in terms of creating better outcomes in terms of GHG reduction. And without having that sort of both structured and then also a longer term, we would advocate for a 15-year term at a minimum, because that's a certainty that both the markets require to have a long-term commitment to the financialization of the program, and then also the structure of infrastructure in transit and climate adaptation and all the sort of things that we hope to build. Those type of projects are planned and funded on 5 and 10-year windows. And so we really have to have a program that structurally allows longer term allocation into specific areas that will allow us at the end of that term to say, this is what we've completed. We have upgraded this number of miles of seawall and have fixed built this number of units of housing, and there's tangible outcomes associated with it, which I think is the thing that allows the program to continue most successfully.
The tangible outcomes is a good reminder. And so for our last question that I have for you, it's really with today's audience, when we think about California policymakers, if they're going to take away just one thing from this conversation you and I are having right now, what should it be?
I think that there is an opportunity before this administration, before this legislature, to really make some generational investments, right? And just like how when Pat Brown in the late 60s, passed the voter-approved bond for the State Water Project, that was constructed over preceding decades, and we've lived in the benefit of that for the last 50 years. So I think things like high-speed rail, investing in sustainable, housing infrastructure, transit, wildfires, organic waste, all of these things, climate adaptation, they're part of a program that could leave a legacy from today. And that, I think, is the opportunity in front of folks, and hopefully they can think big, because that is what's ultimately built California's prosperity today, is we're still standing on the shoulders of the infrastructure investments from the past.